Caitlin Marie Armstrong. On the morning of May 12, 2022, a professional cyclist named Anna Mariah Wilson was found bleeding on a bathroom floor in East Austin, Texas. She had been shot 3 times, and her racing bike had been thrown into some bushes down the street to make it look like a robbery. But the woman who killed her wasn't a stranger, and she wasn't after the bike. She was a yoga instructor from across town, and within weeks she would spend more than $6,000 trying to become a different person. Anna Mariah Wilson, known to friends and fans as Mo, was 25 years old and one of the most promising gravel cyclists in the United States. She had grown up in Vermont, graduated from Dartmouth, and turned a serious hobby into a full-time career on the professional circuit. She was in Austin for a race that weekend, staying at the home of a close friend named Caitlin Cash. Months earlier, Wilson had briefly dated another professional cyclist named Colin Strickland. That relationship had ended, and Strickland had resumed a long-term relationship with a woman named Caitlin Marie Armstrong, a yoga instructor in her mid-30s. Armstrong and Strickland lived together in Austin. On the afternoon of May 11th, Strickland picked Wilson up, took her swimming, had dinner with her, and dropped her off at the house where she was staying. Investigators would later determine that within minutes of that drop-off, Armstrong's black SUV appeared on a neighbor's surveillance camera. Inside the house, Caitlin Cash returned home to find Wilson unresponsive on the bathroom floor. She had been shot twice in the head and once through the heart. Cash immediately began CPR and called for help, but Wilson could not be saved. Investigators recovered 9mm shell casings at the scene. The staged robbery angle collapsed almost as soon as detectives began interviewing the people in Wilson's life. They quickly pieced together the love triangle. Armstrong was brought in for questioning within days, but a paperwork discrepancy over an unrelated warrant allowed her to walk out of the interview and leave the country before an arrest warrant could be executed. She was already on her way to New York, where she boarded a flight to Costa Rica using her sister's passport. What followed was a 43-day international manhunt led by the United States Marshal Service. Armstrong cut her long hair short, dyed it a different color, and began traveling under aliases, including Beth and Ari. For over a month, she moved between hostels along the Pacific coast, teaching yoga informally, paying only in cash, and staying in constant motion. Then, according to a search warrant later reported by KXN Austin on June 23, 2022, she paid $6,360 for plastic surgery at a medical center in Costa Rica, this time under the name Allison Page. How does someone hunted across 2 countries finally get caught? In the end, it was a fake advertisement. Deputy marshals had narrowed her likely location to Santa Teresa, a surfing town on the Nicoya Peninsula, and posted a listing for a yoga instructor position in the area. Armstrong answered it. When she walked into a hostel called Don John's Lodge, a deputy marshal recognized her eyes and a small bandage still visible on her nose. She was arrested on June 29, 2022, and returned to Texas. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence linking her directly to the scene. Her DNA was found on the handlebars and seat of Wilson's bike, and the 9mm shell casings recovered from the bathroom matched a handgun found inside her home. Roughly 3 weeks before her trial began, she attempted to escape custody during a medical appointment and was recaptured within minutes, adding a felony escape charge to the case against her. The trial began in November 2023 in Travis County. According to NBC News, jurors deliberated for about 2.5 hours before finding 35-year-old Caitlin Armstrong guilty of murder in the first degree. Reporting by CBS Austin noted that after another 3.5 hours of deliberation on sentencing, the jury handed down 90 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Under Texas law, she becomes eligible for parole after serving 30 years. During sentencing, members of Wilson's family addressed the court, describing their daughter and sister as a young woman who had spent her life pushing herself to be excellent at something she loved and who had been on the verge of achieving everything she had trained for. As of 2026, Caitlin Marie Armstrong remains incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. Anna Mariah Wilson's family established a foundation in her name to support young women in competitive cycling. If Armstrong's case turned on a single afternoon and a jealous act, the next one stretches across 17 years and 2 states. It required a federal prosecutor to convince a jury of something juries are rarely asked to accept: that lightning had struck the same man twice. Harold Henthorne. In September of 2012, a woman named Toni Henthorne fell 130 feet off a cliff in Rocky Mountain National Park while hiking with her husband on their 12th wedding anniversary. Her husband was the only witness. He told rangers she had slipped while taking a photograph. But 17 years earlier, in 1995, this same man's first wife had also passed away. She had been crushed beneath a Jeep on a remote Colorado highway while allegedly changing a tire in the dark. He had been the only witness to that one as well. Harold Henthorne described himself as a professional fundraiser and a devoted family man. He lived in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. His first wife, Sandra Lynn Henthorne, was a social worker. His second wife, Dr. Toni Bertole Henthorne, was a successful ophthalmologist he had married in 2000. Together, they were raising a young daughter. On the night of May 10th, 1995, Harold and Lynn were driving on a highway roughly 30 miles from their home when he claimed the vehicle got a flat tire. According to his account, he was helping Lynn change it in the dark when the Jeep slipped off the jack and pinned her beneath it. She did not survive. The death was ruled accidental. In the months that followed, Harold collected more than $600,000 in life insurance, according to CBS News. The policy had been purchased just 2.5 months before her passing, and it carried an accidental death rider that doubled the payout from $150,000 to $300,000. 17 years later, Toni Henthorne stepped off the same cliff face on the Deer Mountain Trail. She had been married to Harold for a dozen years by then, and according to investigators quoted by ABC News, Harold had taken out 3 separate $1.5 million life insurance policies on her during that marriage. He was the sole beneficiary on all 3. Federal agents later determined that he had been living off of Toni's income for years. Because Toni had fallen inside a national park, the case fell under federal jurisdiction. Investigators from the National Park Service and the FBI began reviewing Harold's history, and what they found unsettled them. 2 wives had died in remote locations, in circumstances neither witnessed by anyone other than Harold himself. Rangers also learned that Harold had been carrying a map on the day of the anniversary hike, and on that map, an X had been drawn near the exact spot where Toni went over the edge. They further learned that in 2011, Toni had suffered a serious injury during a separate incident at a cabin, one that had also involved only Harold as a witness, and that had been described at the time as another freak accident. In the meantime, back in Douglas County, Colorado, investigators reopened Lynn's case in 2014. This time, they found a footprint on the Jeep's fender, and a coroner changed the official cause of death from accident to undetermined. How do you build a case around a death nobody saw? The federal government's answer was what lawyers call the doctrine of chances, the principle that a coincidence stops being a coincidence once you count it twice. Prosecutors led by then United States Attorney John Walsh built a case that presented Lynn's death not as a separate charge, but as pattern evidence, showing the jury that Harold had already benefited from one wife's fatal accident before the second one occurred. Harold Henthorne was convicted of first-degree murder in September 2015. At his sentencing that December, he insisted he had not taken Tony's life. The judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. His appeals moved through the system with unusual persistence. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction in 2017. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear the case. In 2022, Harold filed a motion arguing that his trial attorney had provided ineffective counsel. That motion was denied in July of that year. He filed a similar claim in 2023, and that too was denied. He was never charged in Lynn's 1995 death, which remains officially closed. As of 2026, Harold Henthorne is incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, serving life without parole. He continues to maintain his innocence. His young daughter, who had been on the anniversary trip when Tony passed away, was later adopted and raised by Tony's brother and his wife. Pattern evidence gave prosecutors in the Henthorne case a body, a fall, and a financial motive to build around. The next case involved none of those things. No body was ever recovered. No confession was ever given directly to police. And yet, a Nashville jury still returned a conviction, largely because of testimony from one of the last people you would expect, the defendant's own father. Perry March. On the night of August 15, 1996, a 33-year-old graphic artist named Janet March vanished from her home in one of Nashville's most affluent neighborhoods. Her husband told police she had left after an argument, taking cash for what he called a 12-day vacation. He waited 2 full weeks before reporting her missing. Her body has never been found. And a decade later, a Tennessee jury convicted him of her murder, largely because of the sworn testimony of a single man, his own father. Janet Gail Levine March was a talented graphic artist. She had grown up in Nashville in a well-known family. Her father, Lawrence Levine, was a prominent local attorney. Her husband, Perry Avram March, was also an attorney. The couple lived in Forest Hills, a wealthy enclave inside the Nashville city limits, in a modern home Janet had helped design. They were raising 2 young children. By the summer of 1996, the marriage was under significant strain. There were allegations of infidelity, arguments over money, and mounting debts. When Janet did not appear for scheduled meetings and did not respond to family calls in the days after August 15th, her parents grew alarmed. But Perry insisted she had simply left of her own accord and would return. He did not file a missing person report until August 29th, 2 full weeks later. That delay drew immediate attention. Janet's car was later found abandoned at an apartment complex, but her purse and her passport were still inside it, an unlikely combination for a woman who had voluntarily left for a long trip. A visitor to the home the day after her disappearance would later tell detectives that Perry's oldest child had been playing on top of a large rolled-up rug in the house, a detail that would take on grim significance years later when investigators came to suspect that the rug had been used to conceal Janet's remains. For years, the case sat in a kind of legal limbo. Perry maintained his innocence and refused to cooperate with detectives. Then, in 1999, he took his young children and moved to Ajijic, a small expat community in Mexico. From there, he became embroiled in a long, bitter custody battle with Janet's parents, the Levines. He fought their efforts to see the children at every turn, at points cutting off contact entirely, and continued to insist on his innocence from across the border. The Levines had never stopped searching for Janet. In the years after her disappearance, they had privately funded investigators and publicly campaigned for renewed attention to the case, never accepting Perry's account of a voluntary departure. That custody battle would eventually lead to Perry's undoing. While incarcerated in a Mexican jail on a separate matter, Perry allegedly tried to recruit another inmate into a plot against Janet's parents. That inmate went to authorities and cooperated with a sting operation. But the most devastating witness against Perry would be his own father, Arthur March. In sworn testimony, Arthur told the court that Perry had confessed to him. According to Arthur's account, Perry had struck Janet with a wrench during an argument on the night of August 15th, taking her life. Arthur further testified that the two of them had later moved her remains and disposed of them in a location near Bowling Green, Kentucky. How do you convict a man of taking a life when there is no body, no weapon, and no crime scene? In late 2004, the Cold Case Squad in Davidson County presented 59 witnesses to a grand jury. Perry was indicted, and in 2005, Mexican authorities detained him and turned him over to United States Marshals, who transported him back to Tennessee to stand trial. He was prosecuted through a series of separate trials. In April 2006, he was convicted of theft in a related matter. In June, he was convicted of conspiracy and solicitation of murder targeting the Levines. And on August 17, 2006, he was convicted of second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. He received a combined sentence of 56 years in prison. His father, Arthur March, received a 5-year sentence for his role in the disposal of the body and passed away in prison in December of that year. As of 2026, Perry Avram March is incarcerated at the Morgan County Correctional Complex in Tennessee. His parole eligibility has been cited in different sources as falling somewhere between 2038 and 2040. All of his appeals have been denied. He continues to maintain his innocence. His children were ultimately raised by their grandparents, the Levines, who had spent years fighting for custody of them, and who saw those years vindicated by the conviction of the man who had once plotted against their own lives. Perry March removed the evidence. The next man on this list did something almost stranger. He built the evidence himself, staged an elaborate scene inside his own home, and for years wore the identity of a grieving hero. Investigators would eventually discover that every part of what he had told them was constructed. Mark Allen Winger. On the afternoon of August 29, 1995, a Springfield, Illinois engineer named Mark Winger called 911 and reported that a stranger had broken into his home and attacked his wife with a hammer. He said he had grabbed his handgun and shot the intruder, who died at the scene, as he tried to defend her. Police examined the scene and initially concluded that Mark had acted in self-defense. In the months that followed, he was praised as a hero, collected life insurance, and remarried. It would take almost 7 years for investigators to discover that every element of what he had told them was fiction. Mark Allen Winger was in his early 30s. His wife, Donna Winger, was a well-liked operating room nurse. The couple had recently adopted a young child and were, by outward appearances, a happy family. The other man who died that afternoon was Roger Harrington, a 28-year-old shuttle van driver. 6 days before the incident, on August 23rd, Roger Harrington had driven Donna and the couple's small child home from the St. Louis airport. During that ride, according to accounts later shared with investigators, Harrington had behaved strangely, at one point discussing a voice in his head that he referred to by name. Donna was shaken by the experience. Mark called the shuttle company afterward and complained about the driver. On the afternoon of August 29th, both Donna and Roger Harrington were fatally attacked inside the Winger home. Mark told police that Harrington had come to the house uninvited, entered, and struck Donna with a hammer. Mark said he heard the commotion, grabbed his handgun from a closet, and shot Harrington to protect his wife. A small child in the household was found physically unharmed. On the surface, it read as a nightmare that had ended the only way it could. Local media portrayed Mark Winger as a devoted husband who had done what he had to do. He received roughly $150,000 in life insurance benefits, along with an additional $25,000 in crime victim funds. 5 months after Donna's passing, he married the family's nanny, a woman named Rebecca Simic. But some of the physical evidence never quite fit. Harrington had been shot in the top of the head, at an angle inconsistent with a man swinging a hammer downward at a seated woman. A neighbor also reported hearing the fatal gunshot roughly 40 minutes after Harrington had arrived, a long interval for a random home invader to have lingered before being confronted. Mark himself kept returning to the police station, unprompted, to check on the progress of the case, a pattern that gradually made detectives uneasy. Then, in 1999, one of Donna's closest friends, a woman named Deanne Schultz, came forward. She told investigators that she had been having an affair with Mark in the months before Donna's passing. Schultz described a relationship in which Mark had spoken openly about his frustration with his marriage and about wanting to be rid of his wife. On one occasion, she said, he had described in detail how he would arrange for Donna's death if it ever came to it, involving a stranger who could be blamed for the act. When she later connected that conversation to the events of August 29th, she went to detectives. Investigators reopened the case. The story that eventually emerged was that Mark had deliberately drawn Roger Harrington to the house that afternoon. When Harrington arrived, Mark himself took Donna's life with the hammer, then shot Harrington and arranged the scene to look like a home invasion he had heroically interrupted. The stranger had not been an intruder. He had been a prop. How does a jury decide who really did what, when the only living witness has spent years polishing his account? On May 29, 2002, Mark Winger was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 5 years later, in 2007, he was convicted in a separate matter. While incarcerated, he had attempted to solicit another inmate to take the lives of Deanne Schultz and a friend of hers named Jeffrey Gelman. That conviction added an additional 35 years to his sentence. As of 2026, Mark Allen Winger remains incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections system, serving life without parole plus the additional 35 years. The young child he and Donna had adopted has been raised by other family members. The Winger case took years to unravel because the man at the center of it was willing to lie in plain sight for as long as it took. The next case involves that same willingness carried further still. A successful woman found in her bathtub, a death first ruled an accident, and a former stockbroker whose alleged efforts to protect himself after the fact would eventually convict him more thoroughly than any single piece of evidence ever could have. Roderick Coughlin. On the morning of December 31st, 2009, a child on the Upper West Side of Manhattan discovered her mother in the bathtub of their apartment. She ran across the hall to her father, who lived in a separate unit in the same building. He came in, told first responders he had pulled his wife from the water and tried to save her, and left with the family. Her death was ruled an accidental drowning. 4 months later, her body was exhumed. And what the medical examiner found would eventually cost her estranged husband the rest of his life. Sheila Danishevsky-Kovlin was 47 years old and a senior wealth manager at UBS in Manhattan. She had built a substantial career and, at the time of her passing, a personal estate valued at approximately $5.2 million. Her estranged husband, Roderick Kovlin, was an unemployed former stockbroker and a competitive backgammon player. Their marriage had ended in a bitter separation, and the two were locked in a divorce and custody battle. Rod had moved into an apartment directly across the hallway from Sheila's. On the afternoon of December 31st, Sheila had an appointment scheduled with her estate attorney for the following day. According to testimony from that attorney reported by Detective Mooney on Oxygen's New York Homicide, Sheila had scheduled the meeting for New Year's Day, 2010, the very day she was found deceased, specifically to remove Rod from her will. That appointment never took place. When first responders arrived at Sheila's apartment on the morning of December 31st, they were told that a child in the household had found her in the bathtub and that Rod had pulled her out and attempted resuscitation. There were no obvious signs of violence. Sheila's family, following the traditions of their Orthodox Jewish faith, declined an autopsy, and she was buried within 24 hours. Her death was recorded as an accidental drowning, most likely the result of a slip in the tub. But suspicion inside her family grew quickly. The circumstances of her passing did not align with the woman they knew, and the timing of the estate appointment troubled them deeply. In April 2010, at the family's request, with the approval of their rabbi, and by court order, Sheila's body was exhumed. This time, the medical examiner conducted a full autopsy, and the finding was very different. Her hyoid bone, the small bone in the front of the neck, was broken. The manner of death was reclassified as homicide. The case had become a homicide investigation, though prosecutors did not yet have a defendant ready to charge. Even so, prosecutors were slow to file charges, and it would be nearly 6 years before Rod Kovlin was arrested. The prosecution's eventual theory was that on the night of December 30th, 2009, Rod had entered Sheila's apartment from across the hall, confronted her, and taken her life before staging the scene in the bathtub. In the meantime, according to trial evidence, he engaged in a series of increasingly disturbing schemes to protect himself. In June 2013, prosecutors alleged he drafted a fake confession note designed to shift blame for the death onto one of his own children, saving the note as a draft in the Apple Notes application on a device synced to that child's account. Prosecutors further alleged that Rod plotted to poison his own parents with rat poison, that he used a library computer to research untraceable poisons, and that at one point he schemed to have a young family member married off in order to access a trust fund set up in her name. During those same years, prosecutors said, Rod attempted to shape the narrative around the case through carefully placed conversations with family members, professionals, and journalists, and to influence what his children would tell investigators about the events of that morning. At what point does a defendant's own conduct convict him more thoroughly than any evidence a prosecutor could bring? Rod Kovlin's murder trial, prosecuted by Assistant District Attorney Matthew Bogdanos, took place in the winter of 2019. In March of that year, a Manhattan jury convicted him of second-degree murder. On April 10th and 11th, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, the maximum available under New York law. His direct appeal was affirmed by the Appellate Division, First Department, in 2022, and leave to appeal that ruling was subsequently denied. In 2023, Rod filed a motion to vacate the conviction, alleging prosecutorial misconduct. That motion was denied in January 2025, with the court noting that the evidence at trial had been overwhelming. As of 2026, Roderick Kovlin remains incarcerated in the New York State prison system, with his earliest parole eligibility calculated at 2040. His appeals are effectively exhausted. His children were raised by other members of Sheila's family after the case unfolded. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Hans Thomas Reiser. On the 3rd of September, 2006, a Russian-trained doctor named Nina Reiser dropped her 2 young children off at her estranged husband's home in the hills above Oakland, California. She was never seen alive again. For nearly 2 years, her body could not be found. The man detectives suspected was a brilliant computer programmer who had created a piece of Linux software used around the world, and who insisted his wife had simply returned to Russia. Then, days before his sentencing, he agreed to reveal where she was. Hans Thomas Reiser was in his early 40s and something of a legend in certain corners of the software industry. He had created the Reiser FS file system, a piece of infrastructure that ran quietly on Linux servers across the globe. He had met Nina in Russia in 1998, and the two had married the following year. Nina was a Russian-trained medical doctor. By the summer of 2006, that marriage was over. Nina had filed for divorce, and the two were locked in a bitter custody dispute over their 2 young children, who were being shuttled between their parents' homes. On the afternoon of Labor Day weekend, Sunday, September 3rd, 2006, Nina drove the couple's 2 young children to Hans's home in the Oakland Hills. She dropped them off and, according to every reliable account, was never seen alive again. When she did not return to pick the children up and did not respond to family or friends over the following days, an alarm went up quickly. Her Russian family, in particular, pushed for an aggressive missing person investigation. Detectives with the Oakland Police Department focused on Hans almost immediately. What they began to find inside his life was strange, then stranger. His Honda CRX had been altered. The passenger seat had been removed and discarded, and the interior had been recently hosed down. Inside the car, they recovered a sleeping bag cover with what would later be identified as Nina's blood on it. They also found 2 books, both about how police investigate homicide cases. In the days after Nina's disappearance, Hans had withdrawn large sums of cash from his bank. When he was arrested on October 10th, 2006, he was carrying his passport and additional cash on his person. Because Nina's body had not been recovered, the prosecution's case would have to be built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. The trial began in late 2007 and stretched for roughly 6 months, during which the jury heard from approximately 60 witnesses. The defense strategy, which would come to be known in the media as the geek defense, painted Hans as a socially awkward programmer who had been misunderstood, and suggested that Nina had simply left the country and returned to Russia to live with her family. That defense might have worked with a different defendant. Hans, however, took the stand in his own defense and spent days on it. He argued with prosecutors, corrected the judge, lectured the jury, and at times seemed to be conducting his own separate trial from the witness stand. Observers who covered the proceedings said his testimony badly undermined his own case. On April 28, 2008, Hans Reiser was convicted of first-degree murder. What happens when a convicted killer, facing the rest of his life in prison, has one final piece of information he can trade? That should have been the end of the story. But in the weeks between conviction and sentencing, Hans's attorneys negotiated a deal with prosecutors in Alameda County. In exchange for a reduction of the charge from first-degree to second-degree murder, Hans would take investigators to Nina's body. In July 2008, he led detectives to a shallow grave near his home in the Oakland Hills, and Nina's remains were recovered nearly 2 years after her disappearance. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in state prison. In the years since, the question of Hans Reiser's future has fallen to the California Board of Parole Hearings, and its answer has been consistent. Hans was denied parole in 2020. He was denied again in 2022. He appeared before the board again at a hearing in October 2025 and was denied for a third time. According to summaries of those hearings, the board has continued to weigh the nature of the crime, his conduct in prison, and his own presentations to the panel against the possibility of release. As of 2026, Hans Thomas Reiser is incarcerated in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation System. His next parole hearing is currently scheduled for October 2028. The 2 young children the couple shared were raised by Nina's family in Russia in the years following the case. The Reiser case took years to solve because there was no body. The next case, by contrast, was solved within weeks. What made it linger in the public imagination was a game show clip that had aired on national television more than 3 years before the killing, and a piece of writing the victim had left behind that came to read almost as a warning. Timothy Bliefnick. In February 2023, a 41-year-old nurse named Rebecca Bliefnick was found deceased in her home in Quincy, Illinois. She had been shot repeatedly inside her bathroom. Her own father, coming to check on her after she had failed to pick the children up from school, was the one who found her. In the weeks that followed, the case would draw national attention for 2 reasons. The first was a note she had left behind for her sister. The second was a clip from a game show that had aired 3 years earlier, in which her estranged husband had joked on national television about the biggest mistake of his wedding day. Rebecca Posel Bliefnick, known to her friends and family as Becky, was a nurse at Blessing Hospital in Quincy, a small city on the Mississippi River in western Illinois. She and her husband, Timothy Bliefnick, were raising 3 young sons. Tim had once been a local celebrity of sorts, a Hall of Fame football player at Quincy University. In the fall of 2019, he had appeared as a contestant on the syndicated game show Family Feud alongside several members of his family. The episode aired in January 2020. In it, host Steve Harvey asked him what the biggest mistake he had made at his wedding was. Tim paused for a beat, then answered by saying, "Honey, I love you, but said I do." He immediately caught himself, laughed, and joked to Harvey that he would be in trouble for that comment when he got home. In early 2020, the moment seemed like nothing more than a contestant reaching for a laugh. In January 2021, less than a year later, Tim filed for divorce. Over the following 2 years, that divorce became increasingly contentious, particularly over custody of the 3 boys. According to friends and family who spoke publicly after her passing, Becky had grown afraid of Tim. She had written, in a note that was later shared with her sister, that if anything were ever to happen to her, the number 1 person of interest should be Tim. A divorce court date had been set for roughly a week after her death. On the evening of February 23, 2023, an intruder entered Becky's home through a second-story window in one of her son's bedrooms, having pried it open with a crowbar. Becky was fatally shot inside the house. The killer had used a homemade silencer, improvised from a small pile of Aldi grocery bags, to muffle the sound of the shots. Her 3 sons were not present at the time. They had been staying at Tim's home about a mile away. When Quincy police and Illinois State Police investigators began examining Tim's digital footprint, they found a striking pattern. He had run Google searches for how not to get caught after committing a crime and for how to construct a homemade pistol silencer. He had created a fake Facebook account under the name John Smith, which he had used to view a bicycle listing that matched a bike seen in surveillance video from the night of the killing. Investigators then searched his home and found dozens of spent shell casings in his basement, apparently the residue of target practice. The Illinois State Police Laboratory examined those casings and determined that they matched shell casings recovered from the crime scene. How does a jury weigh a viral game show clip against a wall of forensic evidence? The trial began quickly by the standards of a murder case. On May 31st, 2023, a jury convicted Timothy Bliefnick of first-degree murder, home invasion, and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. At his sentencing on August 11, 2023, Judge Robert Adrian delivered a summary of what the evidence had shown. He told the courtroom that Tim had researched this killing, planned this killing, and practiced this killing. Because Illinois abolished the death penalty in 2011, the maximum available sentence was natural life in prison. That is what Bliefnick received. As of 2026, Timothy Bliefnick remains in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, serving life without the possibility of parole. The 3 young sons he shared with Becky are being raised by members of her family, who have publicly asked that the boys be granted privacy as they grow up. In the years since the verdict, the Family Feud clip has continued to circulate online, a jarring artifact of a moment that read very differently once the case became public. Bliefnick's case was carefully planned and, according to prosecutors, carefully practiced. The next one is the opposite of both. A young man from Florida who, over the course of a single evening, took the lives of 2 women he had barely met, called his own father from the road to describe what he was doing, and did not appear to be running from anything at all. Wade Stephen Wilson. On the morning of October 8, 2019, police in Cape Coral, Florida, arrested a 25-year-old man named Wade Stephen Wilson. He was suspected in the killings of 2 women he had barely known, killings that had taken place within hours of each other the previous evening. What made the case unusual was his own choice, both during and after the crimes, to phone his biological father and describe what he was doing in real time. He appeared to be genuinely excited to talk about it. Wade Stephen Wilson shared his name with the fictional Marvel Comics character Deadpool, a coincidence that would follow the case through years of headlines. He would eventually be nicknamed both the Deadpool Killer and the Cape Coral Strangler. The 2 victims were strangers to him and to each other. Christine Melton was 35 years old. Diane Ruiz was 43. Both were killed on the night of October 7th, 2019. The evening before, Wilson had met Christine Melton at a bar called Buddha Live in Fort Myers. According to the sequence of events later established at trial, Wilson accompanied her back to her home in Cape Coral. Later that night, he strangled her while she slept. He then stole her car. Driving that car through Cape Coral in the early morning hours, he pulled up alongside Diane Ruiz, who was walking to work, and asked her for directions. When she leaned in toward the passenger window, he pulled her inside. He then attacked her, strangled her, pushed her out of the car onto the street, and according to trial testimony, drove the car back and forth over her body repeatedly. Between the 2 killings, he also attacked his own girlfriend at the time, a woman named Melissa Montanez, who survived and later cooperated with prosecutors. What separated this case from most homicides was Wade Wilson's own decision to describe the killings while they were happening. He phoned his biological father, a man named Stephen Testasekka, from the road, and described what he was doing. Testasekka, according to reporting by the USA Today Network and Court TV, would later testify at trial. He told the court that his son had described the events with excitement in his voice, and that Wilson had told him he had returned to the car after Ruiz had been pushed out and had driven over her again. When the call ended, Testasekka made another call, this one to police. His son was arrested that same morning. The physical evidence quickly aligned with the father's account. Melton's stolen car linked the two crime scenes. DNA evidence tied Wilson directly to both. The information Testasekka had provided allowed detectives to move within hours. In an era in which many homicide investigations rely on painstakingly assembled circumstantial cases, this one had a suspect in custody, a live witness on the phone, and forensic evidence lining up behind the account. What is a jury supposed to do with a defendant who, in effect, confessed to his own father in real time? On June 12, 2024, Wade Wilson was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional counts of grand theft, battery, burglary, and petit theft. In the penalty phase, the jury recommended death, though by non-unanimous votes of 9-3 on one count and 10-2 on the other. Under Florida's revised 2023 law, a non-unanimous jury recommendation of death is sufficient to permit the judge to impose that sentence. On August 27, 2024, Judge Nicholas Thompson imposed 2 death sentences on Wilson, one for each victim. Wilson's direct appeal is currently before the Florida Supreme Court, which heard oral arguments in February 2026. The central issue on appeal is a challenge under the ex post facto clause of the United States Constitution, arguing that Florida's revised death penalty statute cannot constitutionally be applied to Wilson because it took effect after the killings themselves occurred. Wilson's defense team has publicly indicated that if the Florida Supreme Court rules against him, the next stop will be a petition to the United States Supreme Court. The case may ultimately affect not only Wilson's sentence, but the sentences of every defendant in Florida sentenced under the new law for a crime committed before its passage. Legal scholars have described the appeal as one of the most consequential death penalty cases currently before a state Supreme Court in the United States. As of 2026, Wade Stephen Wilson is on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. No execution date has been set. His appeals remain ongoing, and the ultimate outcome may depend less on the facts of the killings themselves than on how the higher courts view the timing of Florida's death penalty law. Wilson called his father from the road because he wanted to. The next case involves a man who left a very different kind of trail. A search on a work computer for the exact location where a body would later be found, and a courtroom fight over whether that digital evidence had been genuine in the first place. Bradley Graham Cooper. On the morning of July the 12th, 2008, a young mother named Nancy Cooper left her home in Cary, North Carolina, and, according to her husband, went out for a run. She never came back. 2 days later, her body was found in a drainage ditch in an unfinished subdivision roughly 3 miles away. She had been strangled. What made this case famous was not the killing itself, but a single piece of digital evidence that would eventually be overturned on appeal, revisited in the court of public opinion, and remain contested to this day. Nancy Cooper was 34 years old. She was originally from Edmonton, Alberta, and had moved to North Carolina years earlier with her husband, Bradley Graham Cooper. Brad, a Canadian originally from Medicine Hat, worked as an IT engineer at Cisco Systems. Nancy was a stay-at-home mother of 2 young daughters. On the surface, the couple lived a comfortable suburban life inside the Cisco corporate corridor of the Research Triangle. In private, according to what Nancy had shared with friends in the months leading up to her passing, the marriage had been strained for a long time. She had described tight financial controls, mutual affairs, and her firm intention to divorce Brad and move back to Canada with the 2 girls. On the morning of July 12, 2008, Brad told police that Nancy had gone out for a run earlier that morning and had not come home. Cary police launched a search. On July 14th, 2 days later, her body was found in a drainage ditch in an unfinished subdivision approximately 3 miles from the Cooper home. She was clad only in a sports bra. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was strangulation. The investigation moved quickly toward Brad. When federal investigators examined his work computer, they told prosecutors that they had found something that appeared to reframe the entire case. According to their analysis, someone using Brad's work computer had performed a Google Maps or Google Earth search of the precise location where Nancy's body was later discovered. That search, they said, had been made the day before her disappearance. The defense contested the finding aggressively. Their own computer experts alleged that the FBI's forensic team had either mishandled the computer or, in the strongest version of the argument, had planted the search themselves. The trial began in early 2011 and ran for 36 days. The prosecution called more than 100 witnesses, including friends of Nancy's who described her final months and forensic examiners who walked the jury through the digital evidence and the strangulation finding. On May 5, 2011, a jury convicted Brad Cooper of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What happens when the digital evidence at the center of a murder conviction is thrown into legal doubt years after the verdict? In September 2013, the North Carolina Court of Appeals overturned Brad Cooper's conviction. The appeals court ruled that the trial judge had wrongly barred the defense's own computer experts from presenting their tampering theory to the jury. The following January, the North Carolina Supreme Court declined to reinstate the conviction. Brad was scheduled to be retried, this time with the disputed evidence subject to a much broader courtroom fight. Rather than face a second trial, on September 22, 2014, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison, with credit for the time he had already served. As part of that plea, he relinquished his parental rights to his 2 young daughters, who were adopted and raised in Canada by Nancy's twin sister, Krista Lister. Brad Cooper was released from Mountain View Correctional Institution in North Carolina in November 2020 and was deported to Canada shortly afterward. As of 2026, he lives in Canada and has no contact with the daughters he once shared with Nancy. The digital evidence at the heart of his original conviction remains a matter of ongoing dispute. Advocates for Cooper, including a small circle of journalists and independent researchers, continue to argue publicly that the search on his work computer was not genuine. Prosecutors and Nancy's family point to his guilty plea to a lesser charge as an acknowledgement of responsibility, and to the underlying facts of the marriage and the disappearance as the more meaningful evidence in the case. The Cooper case remains one of the most disputed convictions in recent North Carolina memory, and one of the clearest illustrations of the difficulty of relying on complex digital forensics in a case that a jury has to decide beyond a reasonable doubt. The Cooper case turned on a single piece of digital evidence and years of argument about whether that evidence was real. The final case in this list turned on something almost opposite: an alibi that appeared on paper to be airtight, a hotel security camera that had been quietly disabled, and a jury that, on the first attempt, could not agree at all. Jason Lynn Young. On the morning of November 3, 2006, a woman named Meredith Fisher arrived at her older sister's home in Raleigh, North Carolina, to check on her. What she found was a scene she has said, in interviews since, she has never fully been able to describe. Her sister, Michelle Young, was on the floor of the master bedroom. She had been fatally attacked in the night. Michelle was 29 years old and several months pregnant. The primary suspect was her husband, but he was more than 150 miles away at the time on a business trip with a hotel key that had never left his room. And that alibi is what the case would come down to. Michelle Fisher Young was a financial consultant working in the Raleigh area. At the time of her passing, she was between 4.5 and 5 months pregnant with the couple's second child. She and her husband, Jason Lynn Young, lived in a suburban home on Birchleaf Drive in Raleigh, together with a young family member. On the night of November 2nd, Jason was in Hillsville, Virginia, roughly 170 miles away, on a work trip for his employer. He was scheduled to remain overnight and to return home the following day. By outward appearances, the couple's marriage was intact. Behind the scenes, prosecutors would later argue it had been failing for some time. Both spouses had been involved in extramarital relationships, and Jason, prosecutors said, had wanted out but did not want the financial and personal cost of a divorce. Michelle was fatally attacked inside the master bedroom of the Young home during the overnight hours between November 2nd and November 3rd. Her sister Meredith discovered her when she arrived at the house after being unable to reach her by phone. Meredith would go on to play a significant role in the years of legal proceedings that followed, testifying at multiple trials and appearing publicly on behalf of Michelle's family. A young family member was in the home at the time of the attack and was physically unharmed. From the beginning, investigators with the Wake County Sheriff's Office were skeptical of Jason's alibi. The theory that would eventually be brought to trial was as follows. On the night of November 2nd, Jason had checked into his hotel room in Hillsville, Virginia. Before leaving the hotel, he had reached up and disabled a surveillance camera positioned in a stairwell of the building. He had then driven the roughly 170 miles back to Raleigh through the night, entered his own home, taken Michelle's life, cleaned up, and driven the same route back to the Hillsville Hotel by the morning. There was no direct forensic evidence placing Jason at the scene. There was, however, a growing accumulation of circumstantial detail. The disabled camera, gaps in his account of his movements, unusual behaviors both before and after the killing, and financial and personal motives that prosecutors said pointed clearly at him. How does a prosecutor build a conviction on the absence of evidence rather than the presence of it? Jason Young was first tried in June 2011. That first trial ended in a hung jury, split according to reporting on the outcome, 8-4 in favor of acquittal. Prosecutors decided to retry the case. On March 5, 2012, on retrial, Jason was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During that second trial, prosecutors were permitted to show jurors video of Jason's own testimony from his first trial, which he had chosen not to repeat before the second jury. Legal analysts at the time described that decision as a turning point. The legal fight, however, did not end with the retrial. In April 2014, the North Carolina Court of Appeals vacated Jason's conviction, ruling that improper civil suit evidence had been introduced at trial, and ordered a third trial. Michelle's family and prosecutors appealed that decision to the state Supreme Court. In August 2015, the North Carolina Supreme Court reversed the Court of Appeals ruling and reinstated the conviction. There would be no third trial. In parallel with the criminal case, Michelle's family had also brought a civil action against Jason. In that civil case, they were ultimately awarded a wrongful death judgment of $15.5 million. As of 2026, Jason Lin Young remains incarcerated within the North Carolina Department of Adult Correction. Reporting from 2024 and 2025 places him at Piedmont Correctional Institution, a medium security facility in Salisbury, North Carolina, where he continues to serve his life sentence. His appeals have been exhausted. The young family member who had been in the home on the night of Michelle's passing has, in the years since, been raised by other members of Michelle's family, who have consistently asked the public and the media to respect that family's privacy as time goes on. That closes out our list of the creepiest murder cases with terrifying plot twists. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.